I'd like to welcome you all warmly to this afternoon's roundtable discussion. My name is Ifwa Aidan Ataja, and I'm the Communication Specialist and Knowledge Management Coordinator for CDD-Ghana. We've actually begun, yes, and I would kindly entreat everyone who has joined us via Zoom to mute their microphone so that we wouldn't get the feedback since we are live on Radio Joy FM. And also, if you want to make a contribution, I'll kindly indicate that you indicate that in the chat box so that the moderator will call on you to speak. If you also don't want to speak, but you want us to read out your question, you can also do so in the chat box and the moderator will read that out. If you are joining us on Twitter, you can also tweet at us. The hashtag for this afternoon's conversation is CDD-RTDs, CDD-RTDs. For those joining us via Facebook and YouTube, you can also type in your questions and submissions in the comments box under the live feed, and it would also be read as well. Without wasting much time, I'll now call on Ambassador Francis Chega, who is a senior fellow with us here at CDD-Ghana, to give us the opening remarks. After that, MFA Apau of the Multimedia Group will introduce the moderator for us.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the board, management, and staff of CDD-Ghana, I would like to welcome you all and also thank you for honoring our invitation to join us for this special edition of our roundtable discussion. CDD-Ghana's roundtable discussions offer a platform that provides an avenue and the space for well-informed reflections and conversations on various topics of national interest. In recent years, the Center, through these discussions, have brought to the fore and initiated national conversations on important topics, such as the Legal Profession Amendment Bill, clinical trials, and just last week, addressed concerns from the general public on the COVID-19 vaccines through this platform. I can therefore want to assure you that these discussions is just not a talk show. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are all aware, March is an important month in Ghana's history. On the 6th day of March 1957, we gained independence from colonial rule. It is a month within which, therefore, we usually reflect on how far the nation has come and how well we have handled our affairs to ensure inclusivity and development for all the citizens of our country. One of the key figures in our history was the late former president, Jerry John Rawlings. His legacy and his contributions to the democratic development in the Fourth Republic is what has brought us together this afternoon. I'm sure many of us have our opinions on the former president. I had the privilege of getting close to him in the course of my career as a Foreign Service officer, when he was the president of the Republic and after he left office, and had the opportunity to have some insight into the person. But we are not here to hear about my insights. But I cannot, however, talk about the late president without mentioning one incident in the course of my association with him, when on a particular day, we had a meeting at the castle. And it was a very, very long meeting. We started early in the morning, and it was getting to about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. I don't know what he saw in me. Then he pointed at me, "Chief, go up and have some food." So I went up Apparently that was his residence, a very small room. His bodyguards were there. There was a table in the middle of the room. And when I sat, there was this parrot bowl with rice and gizzard stew. I love gizzard stew. So I had a very interesting lunch, but that was Jerry Rawlings. No prompting, nothing. But he asked me, and I've had several such other meetings with him when he showed his personal, his passion and everything. I'm certain that historians, scholars, and some people who work with him in the next few years will be writing about various aspects of his life. So who was former President Jerry Rawlings? What did he represent? How did he contribute to the development of democracy in Ghana's fourth republic? We have met today to find answers to these questions, to interrogate his legacy as it relates to the pursuits of democratic development. It is our hope that this afternoon's conversation will also help gather some perspectives from the participants with the view of gaining insights that will strengthen our democratic governance. CDD-Ghana is a think tank dedicated to promoting democracy, good governance, and inclusive development. And we deem it important to assemble persons who have deep knowledge on Ghana's political history and democratic governance, as well as those through the association with him have insights on the late former presidents to lead this all-important conversation. To those listening to us on Joy FM and those watching us live on Facebook and on YouTube, it is our expectation that as we look back into the past, may the lessons we learned through the perspectives shared here today help us in strengthening our democratic governance going forward. Thank you. I hope you have an interesting conversation.
It's my pleasure at this point now to introduce to us our moderator for this afternoon. Our moderator is an associate professor at the University of Ghana's Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research, ISTE, where she teaches courses in the Development Studies MA and PhD programs. She's also the director of the Center of Social Policy Studies, CSPS, at the University of Ghana. She's a scholar of human development and social policy with over 15 years experience in research, teaching, community development, and policy engagement. Her research is broadly in the areas of social policy and social development, with emphasis on work and higher education. Her work frequently explores themes of participation, inclusion, agency, and empowerment by examining how young people and women respond to globalized and neoliberalizing policy structures in their struggles for social and economic rights. Please join me welcome Professor Nana Ekuya Anyidoho, our moderator for this roundtable discussion.
Thank you so much, MFR. And good afternoon to our panelists, our invited guests, and the general audience. I'm very excited to be part of this discussion this afternoon. I think we are in the right moment to take stock and reflect, especially as we are coming on 6th March, our Independence Day, to reflect on how far we've come, particularly in this iteration of our republic. We are in the 4th Republic, which, as we know, began in 1992 with Jerry John Rawlings as the founding president. And since then, since he handed over power in 2000, we have had a series of largely successful, if sometimes contested, elections, and have seen peaceful transfers of power time after time. And I think this is something that we can all be proud of as citizens of this country. So it's a real honor to be here, not as a political scientist, really. As you heard, my area is development policy, social development. So I'm an academic, but I'm also someone who's very interested in these questions, both as an academic and as a citizen or spectator of this country. So I think that I was probably chosen because I do have an interest. I am able to ask, questions that will reflect perhaps what our general audience is interested in, many of whom are non-experts in political science and perhaps in history, but who all have an interest in understanding where we have come from and trying to draw lessons for where we hope to head to in the future. My aspiration for this afternoon's conversation is to really help us to understand, especially for members of our audience who perhaps are too young to have personally lived through the 8 years of Rawlings and Democratic rule, to have a really intimate understanding of what was going on at the time. And this is why I think this conversation, which is just the beginning of many conversations that should be had about the legacy of that period and about Rawlings's legacy more broadly, it's really coming at a good time, because I feel like we have enough distance that we're able to look at that time from a broad perspective, but we are close enough to it that we have people who lived through it as public officials, as students, as academics, and so on. And that is why I am at this point very honored, excited again to introduce members of our panel who are going to help to guide us through some of the really key moments of the beginning of our Fourth Republic. So I'm going to do these introductions in alphabetical order. I'll start with Dr. Amoako-Nneoma. So Dr. Christina Amoako-Nneoma is a former presidential advisor, a former Minister of Lands and Forestry, of Education, and of Environment, Science and Technology. She has also served on many boards, both internationally and in Ghana. In particular, she serves now as chairperson of the Governing Council. Well, no, she served in 2012 to 2016 as chairperson of the Governing Council of GEMPA, as chair of the National Biosafety Authority, and a member of the International Program Advisory Committee of the Netherlands Science Organization, the NWOWOTRO, in The Hague. She's been the convener of the planning committees for the establishment of 3 new publicly funded universities in the Bronga, Hafo, Volta, and Eastern regions. And she's also served as convener chair of the president's team for the conversion of the University of Development Studies into 3 autonomous units. You have to understand that all of these are going to be very abbreviated bios, because these are all very accomplished people. So they'll forgive me if I leave some things out. But this is our first panelist, Dr. Christina Amoako-Nneoma, and you're very welcome.
Thank you.
So we then have Dr. George Bob Milliar, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of History and Political Science at TEC. That's the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. In 2012, Dr. Bob Milliar received his PhD from the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. And he has trained as an interdisciplinary scholar. His research lies at the intersection of the development of political parties, Ghanaian political history, the political economy of development, political ecology, political culture, African diaspora studies, and informal institutions. And And he's published quite a number of articles in many of these areas, or all of these areas. We want to welcome Dr. George Bob Melia.
Thank you for having
Next,
me.
we have Professor Chima Bwedu, who's a co-founder of the Afrobarometer and has served as its executive director, and is now the chair of the board of directors and interim CEO of the newly registered nonprofit corporation, Afrobarometer. He's a former professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Ghana, and he's held faculty positions at universities in the United States, including the School of International Service of the American University in DC, the Center for Democracy, Rule of Law and Development at Stanford University, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the International Forum for Democratic Government. He's a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. and the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences here at home. Professor Chima Bwedu received his doctorate from the University of California, Davis, and undergraduate degree in the University of Ghana. He's published articles on African democratization processes, which have appeared in a number of well-regarded journals. And he's the editor of Democratic Reform in Africa, The Quality of Progress. He's received a number of awards, including the 2017 Martin Luther King Jr. Award for Peace and Social Justice for Advancing Democracy. You're very welcome. Finally, we have Honorable Opong Fosu. The Honorable Akwesi Opong Fosu started his political activities as a student leader and activist and chaired the Legon branch of the June 4th movement. He was appointed in 1982 to the Adansi district as the PNDC district secretary, a position he held till 1985 when he was posted to the Ahafua North district, where he continued as district secretary and later as district chief executive. He has the distinction of being the longest serving district chief executive in Ghana. He also served as a deputy minister of local government and rural development. And under President John Atta Mills, he served as the president's representative at the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development, as a member of the transition team, and was later appointed as the head of local government service. He was elected as the member of parliament for Amenfi East in the Western region and was appointed ministerial portfolios in local government and rural development, environment, science and technology, innovation. Actually, let me take the Minister of State at the presidency responsible for development authorities. Honorable Opong Fosu has addressed international forums such as the UN, the Wall Street Economic Summit, the Marrakesh Security Forum, the Michigan State University, amongst others, focusing on topics of leadership and governance, peace and security, trade and investment, and sustainable development. We are missing today, unfortunately, Dr. Charles Rekubobe, who sends his regrets. But I'm very happy to once again welcome our panelists for today. From the bios, you can tell that they have different vantage points on this topic that we are dealing today with, which is Rawlings and Democratic Development in Ghana. So the way that I've tried to organize it, because there are so many things to talk about. I mean, we could take the longest time, but we only have 2 hours. 1 hour for our panelists and then another hour for, I'm sure, what will be very stimulating discussions. So the way I thought we could go about it is to look at important key moments, seminal moments in this, the lead up to the Fourth Republic and then the 8 years. And the 8 years seems like a short time, but we were going through quite a lot as a country. So there was a lot happening, right? But let's start with that exciting time when we are ramping up to trying this whole republic thing again for the 4th time. We are trying to transition into the republic. And let me ask a broad question, which you can answer very briefly because it's just the initial question. What was your relationship to this moment? of this transition into the Fourth Republic from where you were sitting at the time. And let me start with, just in the order that I made the introductions, in alphabetical order, I'll start with Dr. Mwakunyama.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I came into that system as a senior program officer, really, at the Environmental Protection Agency. A senior civil servant invited to be part of the transition team after the elections. And so that's how I related to the group. I had only very briefly met the then chairman of the PNDC towards the tail end, that is the 1992. I had just met him very briefly. I had some colleagues, some friends from university days who were members of his government. So that's where I was coming from, as a technical person, as a scientist from the Environmental Protection Agency.
Thank you. Dr. Bob Melia, how did you experience this moment of transition between, a few years before and then getting into 1992?
Right. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this exciting panel and to share the same platform with people that I've always admired. Yes, 1992, I was still in, I think, JSS3. So that means I'm the youngest on this platform. Yes, but I felt a bit of the transition because I grew up in a very political family. So the discussions around the transition to multi-party politics, I followed at home. Yes, and the campaigning period, part of it I experienced, but it didn't make sense to me at that time why there was so much talk about a transition to multi-party politics, and as to whether former President Rawlings would hand over and if he loses the election and all that. It didn't make sense to me, but of course, that was my world then. Now things are clearer to me. So that is my entry to that period. Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you. Professor Jima Boedi.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Well, I observed the developments in Ghana at the time from the vantage of a keen student of African politics, Ghanaian politics, and a keen student as well as advocate of democratic governance processes unfolding in Africa from the late 80s and then picking steam in the early 1990s, of which the Ghana transition was a major one. I must also say that I never really had the privilege of meeting President Rawlings ever, except from a very distant room at the Ghana Embassy in Washington, D.C. in 1996 or so, when he came on his, went on his visit there.
Thank you. And Mr. Konfuso.
Thank you, Nanekia. These were exciting and anxious moments for those of us who were already in the system, having for almost 10 years, having worked with Chairman Rawlings and experienced a way of doing things. Now, this were new for the transition. We didn't know what to expect. And we were also looking forward to having that kind of experience with multi-party democracy.
Right. So I took my role as proxy for the audience very seriously, because I asked a whole bunch of people, what question would you want to ask? What kind of topics would you want to be discussed at this point? And I asked colleagues and historians of political sciences and students. One of the questions that came up was just trying to get an understanding of how both the administration and the head of that, the head of state at the time, navigated the transitions. We know that there is never just one cause for anything, right? But people are very curious to know, to what extent was this transition to democratic rule something that was motivated and discussed internally, and to what extent was it influenced by the global discourse at the time about reinstating the state and letting it be, a proper kind of state, a state that was interested in good governance. We had that discourse going on globally and those kinds of pressures. Let me start with Honorable Oponfosu. Can you give us some sense of how these external and internal forces work together to bring us to this point where we decided we wanted to move from military rule to a democratic dispensation again?
Right from the very beginning, the leader of the revolution emphasized on participatory democracy. And his concept of power to the people meant that people must be involved in the decision-making processes as well as be inclusive in the distribution of wealth. That was one of the key areas that he was passionate about. So following that, we had the district assembly concept. So for me, the grounds were being prepared even before we got into the global push for multi-party democracy. And it wasn't such a major step because there were already processes in motion. And when he set up the National Commission for Democracy to collate views on the way forward with our governance, it became clear that Ghanaians wanted us to have a multi-party democracy and a constitutional rule as our governance system. But then the foundation had already been laid and people have been motivated to get actively involved in decision-making at the grassroots level. So Ghana was already in motion in respect of the global push for democratization. And if you look at the concept of the district assembly and the decentralized governance, we had initiated this way before the global push for multi-party democracy, constitutional rule, and all the associated elements.
Thank you. Professor Jimabwedi, I know you've written, about this period. And again, this is why it's great to have people in different locations, different perspectives and vantage points. The person who asked this question, about the internal and external influences, used the phrase, she said, is it true that Rawlings was a reluctant Democrat? Was there some, perhaps, you've got a government that came in through revolutionary means, right? And now we are sort of trying to conventionalize them into a Western model of democracy. Was there perhaps some hesitance or some doubts about whether or not this was the right model for Ghana at the time? Can you share your perspective on that?
Sure, plenty. And first of all, I would say the phrase reluctant Democrat is probably the most charitable way to talk about and to describe former President Rawlings with respect to democracy, not necessarily with respect to many other things, but with respect to democracy. First, you've got to remember that for several years into his administration, as the leader of the PNDC, whenever the question was posed, when are you going to hand over power? Asked because Ghanaians were used to having military governments handing over after 3 years in the case of the NLC, 5 years, maybe 7 years, and then in the case of the SMC, and then only 3 months in the case of Jerry Rawlings and EFRC. So the idea that a military government is not a normal government for Ghana and that it must consider handing over to an elected civilian administration was already an established part of Ghanaian expectations. So then comes, was it really voluntary on the part of President Rawlings and his cohorts in the PNDC to hand over at the time that they did? I think we have to recall global developments at the time. This was the time of the end of the Cold War. This was the time of the fall of communism and the loss of many of President Rawlings and his regime's foreign friends, especially in the East Bloc countries. This was the time when apartheid was unraveling and white rule was giving way to rule by the majority. And then also, we have to think about the many, many internal forces and internal factors at work in Ghana at that time. We have to recall the persistent internal opposition and also opposition by exiled Ghanaian groups who were greatly emboldened by Professor Dubois-Hines' 1998 lectures. We have to think of the work of internal opposition groups that had coalesced around the People's Movement for Freedom and Justice, which brought together the right and the left of the Ghanaian establishment political group. We have to think of the heroism and activism of individuals like Kwesi Pratt, Kweku Bakum, lawyer Kutuampao, as well as individuals who had been part of the PNDC regime in an earlier time, such as Mr. Johnny Ndebugre and Johnny Hansen, and even Major Courage Kwashiga, who had tried to stage a coup. So I always ask the question, if you're going to call former President Rawlings a hero of the Ghanaian democratization process in the Fourth Republic, you also have to ask, what shall we call somebody like Professor Dubois-Hines? What shall we call Kwesi Pratt, Kweku Bakum, Akutuampao, who suffered imprisonment for pro-democracy activities? And I just want to make a last point about the local government reforms as some sort of a prelude to the democratic transition. We also have to remember that that whole effort, at least to me as a student of politics, was part of a plan to evade the pressure at the time for the government to credibly address the question about when this 10-year-old, 9-year-old provisional government was going to hand over. And we should also see those reforms as something of a trial balloon for the regime and for head of state, Jerry Rawlings, to get a sense of his popularity in the countryside, and therefore some sort of a test of the ground for maybe an election in which he was going to win. And then also, just to add that by the structure of the district assembly, the structure of the decentralization program, the whole reform and the elections provided the President Rawlings and the PNDC to extend the swings structurally and politically to the countryside, and to make sure that it had 11 and 10 key supporters there, key advocates there, key representatives of the regime, as well as the 1/3 of the members of the assembly in all those places. So really, I mean, I totally disagree with the idea that the Ghana system of local government and the decentralization arrangement has anything to do with Ghanaian democratization. And in fact, I may even argue that it is a big part of why democracy in the Fourth Republic has been suffering the fate it has suffered so far of over-centralized executive, and an executive whose hands, and a president whose hands reach all the way to the rural areas and to the countryside, and make local people clients of the president and usually the incumbent party.
Thank you for your perspective, Professor Jima-Boadi. I want to pick up on, you said a lot of things, and I'm just picking up on one part of it. Also in a self-serving way, because it feeds into my next question. But while we all understand that there are, again, different factors for why we do anything, whether as individuals or as a country in our decision making, I also sometimes get a little bothered when everything that we do is attributed to some external agents. So I just want to pick up and amplify your observation that there were a lot of different people, a lot of different associations, you know, who wanted this kind of transition. So I'm going to ask Dr. George Bob Milia and Dr. Christina Amwakunyama if they want to comment briefly on what was happening at the so-called grassroots level that also brought us to this moment of transition. Let's start with Dr. Bob Milia.
Yes, thank you very much. And yes, I largely agree with Prof. Jima-Boadi's perspective, but we also have to understand that where Ghana was coming from, the lot of instabilities, First Republic, Second Republic, Third Republic shortly, then there's a military regime. The idea was to search for an alternative to those that we've experimented and they failed. So the idea was to get us to try and evolve something that would be unique to the Ghanaian system. So to give power to the grassroots. And that experiment is what led to the decentralization. But like others have argued, the decentralization policy on paper was good, but that it failed to achieve transforming the decentralized localities, transforming the grassroots, transforming the rural areas, and giving real power to the people. Okay, but you that all of these have added up to what we now have and we're celebrating as the Fourth Republic. Now, yes, we were experimenting. And it took us a long time to experiment. We didn't get it right, but eventually we have succeeded in having a Republican dispensation that has lasted. I would go back a bit and disagree with my professor, and that the idea of handover, and Jerry Rawlings' reply, handover to whom, yes, is something that pro-democracy activists demanded for. But I've argued elsewhere that had Jerry Rawlings handed over to a civilian regime after 2 or 3 years, we have been back to where we started from. That there's no way two ways about it. He has engineered a system to survive that long. But that J. Rawlings defied the opposition and stayed on for that long. At least when it was time for him to go, he didn't complain. He supervised an election, his party lost, and he handed over. So for me, yes, the starting wasn't the best, where all of these challenges coming in, but it was an experimentation period. The same way with decentralization to the grassroots, that on paper, the concept was bright, but that decentralization and power transfer, empowering the people at the grassroots is where my take on what you asked, Nana. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Yeah, Nana, my contribution will be very brief on this part, because I'm not a student of politics per se. At the time, there were a lot of people who contributed to all that was going on: the students, the professional bodies, and many others. We perhaps will defer to the political scientists and some of the others. 7 FM. But really, in writing our history, or in rewriting the history, as some people are wont to be doing now, we ought to remember that at any given time, a person is very complex. J. Rawlings was not a simple person, or someone you could characterize and pigeonhole into some political straitjacket. The way I saw him and the way I interacted with him. So this is the only contribution I can make to this point, please.
And thank you so much. As somebody with a psychology background, I love your points about realizing that, you know, people are complex and complicated and, you know, very multifaceted. And as somebody who interacted with him, Dr. Marco Nyama, how did he make the transition from being a head of state to being a president of a fourth republic? Again, as human beings, you know, you again, we saw him come in first as this revolutionary leader. It's a very different modus operandi from now being, you know, a president with a cabinet and a parliament and judiciary and, you know, other arms of government that are there to act as checks and balances and can sometimes be oppositional.
Yeah, I can't pretend to know the way he was thinking or what he did, but
no, just from your observation of how he did.
Observation. The man was so passionate about doing what is right for Ghana. You couldn't interrupt passion for doing the best that he could for Ghana. This is what I got. And the issue of always stressing integrity, honesty, transparency. These are words that of a cabinet, the workings of relationships, the inclusion of all the regional components. He was always so committed, making sure that every region was represented, something that we would be looking at. And for me, these are areas that we must, perhaps Nana, as the psychologist or the other political scientists, I think these are areas where we need in this, our country, to be looking forward. If we are looking at legacy and so on, these are areas that we ought to begin to look at. I'm not sure.
No, it's absolutely answered the question. Thank you. My next question, again, thinking about, you know, pivotal moments, it has to do with what had previously been a culture of silence. Professor Jima Bwedi made a reference to Professor Dubois, who actually spoke about this in one particular speech of his, and really was quite remarkable in articulating into the Fourth Republic what I remember as a student university at the time was just this opening up of the civic space, right? Media, civil society, and so on. My experience of it as a student was suddenly realizing that we had so many different radio stations, which was very exciting. But obviously, there's much more to it than that, than what I was experiencing in my room at the University of Ghana. So let me start now this time around with Professor Jima Boedi. Can you reflect a bit on how that happened, what happened, and what its significance was, this opening up of both media and other civic spaces?
First, we have to begin from the chill, the deep chill that the 11 years of Flight Lieutenant J.J. Rawlings and PNDC had brought upon nation and the likes. We have to remember that. And I just want to recount a brief personal experience. In 1993, I launched a book that I had edited called the Ghana and the PNDC Role. Ghanaian, major player in the private sector and in civil society and basically in Ghanaian society at large, to come and chair the launch event. He agreed in principle, but correctly requested to see a copy of the book whose launching he was going to preside over. So I went to see him in his very large, expansive bungalow. As soon as I showed him a copy of the book, and here's a copy of this is the book, Ghana and the PNDC Rule. And then he saw the photo and everything. I could see a change in his facial expression. He immediately declared that he was indisposed and that he won't be able to chair the event. If you want to talk about that, nonetheless, yes, immediately after the transition, things began to open up. The media space began to open up. Free association began to be permitted. Institutional litigation for the government to accept the right of opposition parties and unions and others to demonstrate and to hold protests without an explicit police permit. Even that had to be litigated. We have to remember the ordeal of one of our panelists who couldn't make it, Dr. Rekudrobe, when he had the temerity to try and set up an independent radio station. You've got to think about those who were detained, imprisoned for daring to publish things and to say things, who were then jailed under the criminal libel legislation at the time, which was enthusiastically used by the government in order to basically clamp down on free speech. And I have to say that the culture of silence was really never broken, legally speaking, until 9 years into the administration, when the Kufuor government decided formally removed from our books criminal libel. Even then, I must say, it still hasn't gone away. When my parents were alive, anytime they heard I was part of the leadership of an election observation project, first at the IEA and then at CDD, they all got upset. They had my big uncles in Accra calling me to tell me that my parents are stiff worried. So I think that I appreciate all of this, and in fact, I do appreciate the point that my colleague Dr. Melia made, that maybe we should be grateful that in the end, Ghana didn't go, or President Rawlings didn't go the Museveni way, or didn't go the Laurent Gbagbo way, whereby a leader like that would prefer to take the country down to the drain and on the path of violent civil war rather than allow themselves to leave power. I appreciate that point very much. And I say this with seriousness because we live in a country where even leaders of churches with 10,000 members, maybe a few thousand members, move heaven and earth not to allow themselves to be retired. We live in a place where public servants holding small, director positions will do everything, doctor their age 10 times or 3 times in order to continue to stay on. So if you've been in power in Ghana for 19 years, used to adulation and adoration, used to being called chairman, flight lieutenant, president, His Excellency, commander-in-chief, whose every word is a command, who is the monarch of all that he is obeyed and all, who agrees to leave office, even fearing that your enemies may come after you, I guess some credit is due to you, and I perfectly accept that.
Dr. Bomilia, do you want to share your thoughts on that, and then we'll go to Honorable Professor.
Oh, thank you very much, but not to duplicate what Prof has said. You realize that there was a constitution in place, but that the media space was still very restricted. You couldn't express yourself. We saw journalists who were harassed even under the early part of it. I don't want to repeat what Prof said, but it's only.
Okay. Mr. Pomfusu.
Yes, a lot has been said, and I want to just come with some perspectives. On his announcement on 31st, he said, this is a revolution, this is not a coup, but a revolution to end all coups. And since then, we've come to this. In all the commentaries that have been made over the years, there's still some elements, some are more of opinions than the facts. When we have this kind of conversations, we seem to leave out the turbulent environment that we were in, which was not limited to only Ghana, but around the West Africa sub-region. Probably, if he had not emerged the time he did, maybe we would have also gone along the lines of countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone and others who were also experiencing those chaotic moments. In the countdown into the transition and in his administration, there were still suspicions that he might amend the constitution to remove the term limit and stay on. That didn't happen. There was also suspicion that in the event that NDC loses power, he will not hand over. That didn't happen. Between 2008 between 2000 and 2008, there were rumors and expectations of another intervention by Rawlings. It didn't happen. I think that we need to give the credit where it is due. And I'm happy Dr. Jimebuadi at a point referred to that. Some of the experiences being recounted here in terms of media attacks and other suppression.
Oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't the question. The question actually was, how did this opening up of the media space, which people have pointed out was gradual. I wanted to get a reflection on how that happened, how different segments of civil society were engaging with it.
we're having a conversation. This conversation goes very fast. So if there are some issues raised here, and there are those with the experience can explain.
Much sometimes has been said about some maybe rude comments that he may have made about people's relationships with their surroundings. But I think that was born out of a real deep commitment to the country and to the countryside, and how we related to our surroundings. I think in the environmental area, many people know the commitment and the contributions that late President Rawlings had during his 8 years as president of Ghana.
Thank you very much. I shouldn't even have just said segments of people. We can also talk about his relationship to institutions like, you know, the judiciary and so on. So again, just expanding the question even further. Professor Jimabwedi, what's your take?
First, I would like to comment on what I saw of and as his relationship to the Ghanaian private sector. I would describe it as accept co-optation on my terms as President Rawlings, keep silent or be crushed, using state power and presidential power. Then relationship with the opposition, relationship with the political opposition. I would describe it as generally, I got the sense that he had a sense of revulsion at his opponents, at one point describing them as, quote, punks. And then also his relationship with independent civil society, meaning relationship with associations other than those sanctioned as organs of the revolution, other than those sanctioned as friends of the government or the president. Those relationships were usually fraught, and I'm not sure if he ever got comfortable with any of that till he left the earth. On one occasion, in the 2000, CDD-Ghana, which we had formed not too long, had organized a meeting with the senior brass of the Ghana military to explore ways of democratizing civil military. Akosobo at the Water Hotel got to him after the fact. He called the generals who had allowed that meeting to occur and excoriated them properly for allowing an NGO to infiltrate the military.
Of the society, the youth, women and children, rural poor, those in the academia, this key personality, prominent citizens, all worked with him. That is a reflection on the kind of leader that we had. And in relation to district secretary without any experience at age 24.
Wow.
Yes, and most of the people were in their early 20s. It's just the commitment to what he believed in that resonated, afflicted us, including, like, say, healthcare. He was at the forefront. Burili ulcer, guinea worm eradication, name them. He will be at the forefront. When balance sheets and assess the situation dispassionately, we would have realized that in terms of what the negatives and the positives, Ghana's economy as a failed economy. That was where we were. So he has brought stability. He has connected with segments of the society, all segments, women, children, that resulted in the expansion of electricity to almost all parts of the country. We can go on and on and on. His contribution has been quite great. And for
Yes, thank you so much. Let me add something to what has been said already. I would like to look at the attempt to bridge the development gap between Northern Ghana and Southern Ghana, especially the Upper West region. So you had Bolgatanga as the regional capital. The western part, which is now Upper West, was part of the upper regions. After overthrowing the Liman region, within a year, on 14th of January 1983, the PNDC decreed the creation of the Upper West region. Almost all the development were concentrated in Northern Ghana, in Northern region as we knew it then now, Tamale, then Upper East, what is now Bolga. But for the western part of the region, it was totally a no man's land. That part of Ghana was not linked to any sort of education. But that his letter announcing to him of his promotion was in Bolga for almost 2 years. He couldn't go there. The only way he could travel to Bolga was to come to Tamale and now take the road from Tamale back to Bolga. From Wa to Bolga regime and some of the things that Rawlings did, that having overthrown a son from that region, he immediately after, within a year, he decreed the creation of the region. So that development gap between the North and the South, he attempted to bridge it. One other thing that we've not mentioned is that until Rawlings, almost all the public universities were in the southern part of Ghana. University of Ghana, Accra, Cape Coast, KNUST in Kumasi. He's the father of the University for Development Studies. And that's the first public university in the northern part of Ghana. Okay, so we initiated in trying to bridge the gap. Honorable talked about the rural electrification, which is another massive thing that has transformed the landscape of Northern Ghana. You know, I was told that by 10 p.m. light will go off, people will go to sleep because they were using the generator set. Heading towards Wenchi, that you will now meet a motorable road. That was how Ghana was before he came. So in terms of trying to bridge this development gap, I think this is another plus that we can talk and give so many examples. So that is how I want to look at it.
So ways to go in terms of making people feel part of the larger country. I did some work in the Afram Plains. I'm really interested in young people and their aspirations. And one of the things that they would say is, oh, they really want to go overseas. And I'm like, yes, definitely a long ways to go, but I understand your point about how much further that administration brought us. Professor Jima Bwedi, you wanted to add on to what you said before?
Yes, just a quick point, and to also say that I have his leadership qualities, and not in terms of his overall contributions to modern Ghana and to Ghana's present development at all. My focus has been on his contribution to the development or otherwise of democracy. I just wanted to fail an omission in the record of the J.J. Rawlings J.J. Rawlings praise singing, because it's something that also relates to our democratic stability. And it's an area in which people have not normally given him credit. You know, at the end of his time in office as elected and unelected leader, he had substantially helped to normalize economic management, initiate economic rationalization measures, to initiate cost-saving measures, to introduce user fees for enjoyment of state services, to privatize for a 48% or so devaluation of currency, and for introduction of student loan scheme or the trouble that the Liman government got for daring to hold a conference in Ghana to advertise Ghana's gold, want to give President Rawlings credit for, is the claim of being either the father of democracy, the founder of Ghanaian democracy, or being a great Democrat. That, I think, is false and doesn't do justice to the record.
Comments, and why not? I'll summarize some of those comments. There are people just generally appreciating that this is an insightful and exciting discussion. This is a direct quote from Ahmed Al-Hassan on Facebook, who says he's out to discuss the issue on board, and that he had his own personal, I guess, bias or perspective of Rawlings and his administration, and he's getting some new insights. So that's good. That's the whole point of this conversation. Honorable Pomfosu, somebody has some work for you. They think that you are doing a great job just bringing your insider perspective. And Wilson Kofi Mensah Tito says you owe it to this country to chronicle the political development of the era. So I suppose he wants you to write a book or something. So you can maybe add it to the PNDC days, but we really wanted to focus this discussion on the post-democratic era, because what we want to do is to figure out in this dispensation of our republic how we can move forward. But somebody did have maybe a comment that's directly related to something you said, Professor Jima Boidi. He's recalling that as far back as 1985, journalists like the late Mr. Joe Bradford Gina could come on radio and exaggerated. I'm allowing this question, even though it's about the 1980s, because it talks to where we were before the 1992 transition. So it's a technical, a technical point. Professor Jima Boidi, your thoughts?
Well, I have contrary recollection, I think from the castle or somewhere, and he was one who was always doing a commentary on Ghana broadcasting, praising, basically praising the regime. So I don't know if it's such a good example. I think my colleague who asked the question should just go and ask what were the newspapers operating in Ghana up to 1987, 88, 89? What were they like? They were mainly lotto racks and religious papers.
And so I guess this gives me the license to ask my perhaps, it won't be last question because we have a bit more time. I wanted us to reflect. Now we've sort of moved through the history up to the 2000 transition, which again, just in keeping with me not asking a very specific question, but just asking you to reflect on this from your perspective at the time and maybe looking back. How important is it? How successful was it? What can we learn from that particular transition as a prelude?
The lack of, how shall I put it? The lack of, I will call it the lack of commitment to Ghana. Because for me, the team that had been put together to just go through the motions. But fortunately, since then, there have been improvements. I really think there have been improvements. But the 2000 transition was a difficult thing to see people that I knew behave, fairly senior people that I knew, respected, behave the way they were doing at that time was a little disappointing for me. I am still thinking that the political extremism, the extreme partisanship, the refusal to see anything good in a political opponent, almost like you are enemies. And yet we all have the interest of Ghana at heart, or we claim to. Only that we may have different approaches, or we may think we have different approaches to getting to the same end. So for me, this is something I really would like to see for the real history of Ghana, because people pretending or trying to rewrite history at any given time. The more you shout doesn't mean that the rest of us were not here. I was going to secondary school, so I wasn't that much of a child. And I went through the period of Nkrumah and all those periods. So we saw things. So this glorification of certain periods.
The process that gave you power in the first place, you want to undermine it. And in Ghana, that is where we are now. Immediately you lose power, you want to undermine the system. But the system is not perfect, and the system is not perfect anywhere. You have to build it so that it would become resilient as you go along. So for me, the transition itself and the process to consolidating democracy, for me, are very important for the 2001 election. Right, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more comments, responses to my question, or should I? Okay, Professor Jemah-Boadi, yes.
Look, I just wanted to, the very passionate and very important point and advice that Honorable Makuniyama has shared. I take it to heart, but I think there has to be, we have to make a distinction between partisanship at the political party, political competitor, political contestants level. That's NDC, MPP partisanship, for example. That is unfortunately an ugly part of our politics. But I also want to say that it didn't start with the PNDC. It didn't start with the NDC, with President Rawlings as president. As she mentioned, the NLM CPP era. We went through that. We went through the Progress Party, NLM, and Progress Party now, National Alliance of Liberals time. We went through that. So this has been a very major part of our political culture. It has a cure, and the cure is basically taming power, so that when people are in power, they are not gods, they are not seen as gods, they don't see themselves as gods, who then create counter gods in the form of the opposition for them to also do a backlash. That's a general, but for us as students of politics, it's very important to get the facts and to get the records. And that for somebody like me, who's taking pains to study these things in detail and to research and to talk to people who participated in the crafting of the 1992 Constitution, none of whom is able to tell me how the transitional clauses came into being. I have to conclude that they were put there by hidden powers. They were put into the Constitution in order to provide ironclad guarantees to President Rawlings that when he left office, his enemies will not get at him. For somebody who has read fairly credible accounts of attempts made by people inspired by President Rawlings, or maybe even instigated by him, to stage a rearguard action to foil the 2000 transition, the 2001 transition, I cannot, these things must be researched, these things must be put on record if they are confirmed, so that we get our history right. Because failing to get our history right is the wrong way for us to go about nation building. Finally, on this point, I've already given a lot of credit to President Rawlings for leaving office without a big fuss or basically taking Ghana down the line. But I also think we ought to give credit to the opposition that, for instance, decided to write a book instead of going into the streets when they felt cheated in the 1992 election. We have to give credit to those close associates of President Rawlings who found clever ways of giving him comfort and assurances so that he would allow the 1992 transition to take place, and ultimately so that you allow the very important 2001 transition to take place. We have to give them credit. We have to give credit to that general who walked into that room where rear guard soldiers were apparently plotting to disrupt things and say, gentlemen, this is not going to happen. We have to give people like that credit. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely important. And talk about President Rawlings and the development of democratic governance, the development of democracy in the country. We have to remember that, you know, there are a lot of people in this country all doing their part. And I think that dynamic between a leader and his people is very important to keep reminding ourselves of. So I'm going to ask two questions, one of Mr. Oponfosu and one of Dr. Bob Milia. And then I'm going to ask a final roundup question for all the panelists. So these two questions are from our audience. For Honorable Oponfosu, Bernard Owusu-Kwarteng on Facebook says that in his first tenure as a democratically elected leader, President Rawlings virtually had no opposition in Parliament. How could his government be put on its toes in policy and in budgeting?
Yeah, that's a very good one. We had the NCP as a minority party in Parliament, the National Convention Party, and in Parliament, but in alliance with the NDC. So even outside Parliament, the NPP did a good job in putting the government on its toes. Around that time, the media space has been opened. There were civil society organizations that were also monitoring and holding government to account. So it wasn't just in Parliament, absence in Parliament that we are talking about, but even outside Parliament, the opposition continued to hold the government to account.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bomilia, a couple of people commented on your discussion of Rawlings's effort to bridge the gap between Northern and Southern Ghana. One of your former students, Mohammed Tijani, thought it was a very interesting observation. Kofi Aprechum on Facebook also thought it was an interesting observation, but he wonders if Rawlings really had a strong influence on bridging the North-South divide. What explains the persistent imbalance between the North and the South, leading to the current creation of the Northern Development Authority? Did his administration maybe instead deepen the colonial bias to some extent? So he's...
Thank you very much for the question. Now, if we want to go deep into understanding the endemic poverty in Northern Ghana, we will not finish today.
And please don't start. You're an academic like me. Yes. Once we get started on a thesis.
Yes, so I'll be very brief. That it's a region that has suffered neglect for a very long time. It was colonially engineered. The North was a labor reserve to serve the southern mines and cocoa plantations. And Nkrumah came and introduced his free education policy, trying to bridge that. Other leaders after Nkrumah, this historical neglect. And of course, it wasn't only the North that demanded government attention. Other parts of Ghana wanted the same. So that is why the problem is still there. And currently, the governing party thinks that the way to develop the North is to use the Northern Development Authority. Yes, under the NDC, they introduced SADA. All of these are attempts to try to bring about development. But because the North has never seen real development, you would have to invest a lot so that you can bring it up to the level that everybody appreciates. So whilst these resources are being poured into the north, you wouldn't see it as transforming the whole region. So you still see people migrating from northern part of Ghana to the southern part in search of jobs that doesn't exist. All the careers that we see are coming from the northern part. Yes, not that governments have not attempted. Governments have attempted and they're continuing to do that. But it's just this historical neglect that is at the basis of it. So I would put the blame at the doorstep of the British, not the Ghanaian leaders that came after. If the British had, I can see Prof is smiling, if the British had done some groundwork foundation, perhaps the North would have catch up with the rest of Ghana. But when Nkrumah took over the country, North, he started to introduce all those. Leaders after him have come, but it's a major problem. It's a major problem, yes. So that is why we are not.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, it's not something one government can tackle entirely. I agree completely. From Rawlings' administration, his 2 terms as president of the Fourth Republic, that we can move forward with as a country. Again, anything you want to say from your particular vantage points. And while you are thinking about that, I would like to just quickly mention a couple of names of people, not a couple, names of some people who've really been engaging with this conversation on Facebook and YouTube. They probably didn't ask a specific question, but they are making comments that other people can read. So Michael Kwesi Demos, who's on Facebook, Ahmed Al-Hassan, I think I mentioned his name already on Facebook, Bernard Owusu Kwarteng on the same forum, Wilson Kofi Mensah Atito, Kwejo Nketia on YouTube, and Anda Achulewa on Facebook, Kwejo Aprechum, I mentioned his name already, Richard Ajao on YouTube, and also Catherine Mfomangum. I'm so sorry if I butchered your name, but she is an invited guest on Zoom and made a comment that really just to congratulate Rawlings and Ghanaians for our work in and this is a good segue to the question I asked them. Then moving forward, what do we take that we can work with, or what lessons do we learn about what not to do moving forward? And
quote unquote, or a new Ghanaian woman who is patriotic, who is not self-serving, who is not corrupt, and all of that. And we are not going to get rid of an party. It's essential, it's necessary for our existence and our continued progress as a nation. Second, we've got to also change the culture of Ghana. We have to see a sense of duty. Duty meaning being willingness to pay your taxes, being available for national service if the nation needs you, being is that imbalance that makes us all sit somewhere and say that, well, CDD, you talk corruption, somebody is being corrupt, go and talk about it, and then I don't have any part in this. We have to change that. And it's as Prof. Sajima Boidi said, it's a really big question. So just think of it as your take-home message. What's the one thing, if people forgot everything else, what's the one lesson that you think we should move forward with from these reflections?
Yeah, I think as Prof has said, the discussion has to continue. We have to build on some of these legacies, the mistakes that have been made, the missteps. It's important that we really are interesting to me, a non-political scientist. I think that we must expand and enlarge on these and let all our students, let the civic education become a bigger deal than it is now. We are not educating the citizens on our citizenship rights and obligations.
Thank you. Spoken like a true former Minister of Education. And I would like to think that this conversation that we've had today has been part of Educated Citizens. To be honest, me sitting here as an academic that likes to think that I'm fairly well informed. Honorable Oponfusu.
Yes, from what I know, the historical antecedents to all this up to where we are, was a reluctant Democrat. I would say he was a reluctant leader from all the events. He was thrust on us by some group, especially June 4th and all that. So when I reflect, I tell myself that if we had not experienced all that in our body politic, in our leadership, exercise of leadership and all that, we wouldn't have even known Jerry Rawlings. He would have maybe retired as an army officer. But the exigencies of the times brought him into the limelight. So what are the lessons? Did we learn anything from that, or are we back on the path of embracing corruption and all the issues that resulted in we having Jerry Rawlings as a leader? He had concerns about, even though people say these are some of the issues that going forward we have to address our minds to, because if we continue the way we are going with electing leaders